Welcome to another episode of the Lords of Consciousness videocast. I am your host, Clint-culberson, coming to you from the sunny deserts of Arizona. And today I'm really excited to welcome back a guest that we had on last year, one of our most popular videos that we've had, author and lecturer James-Perloff. James, welcome back, my friend.
Well, it's very good to be back on Lords of Consciousness, Clint. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. You know, you are someone who has been a huge part of my life in waking me up to what's been going on on the global scene, if you will, through your writings. And it's a real honor to have you to talk today about a topic that we just said it before we came on, but it's a topic that I hope we do not ever forget, because it's something that is very unresolved, and the people behind it have yet to come to true justice for it, and that is 9/11. And what the events that took place on September 11th, 2001. And last year on your website, james-perloff.com, you wrote these big pieces about 9/11 in terms of the we'll call it the 9/11 revisited in some ways, and it was a two-part series that ended up basically, from the feedback from the first one, you had 6 pilots who reached out to you and you guys started having a lot of communication, technical conversations on, the likelihoods of certain scenarios taking place, and some of even your ideas you kind of tossed out based on the information they gave you, and then some other ones even became more concrete, and we should look even more into them. So, before we really get into those articles, I want to ask you, why is it so vital that why is it so vital that we don't forget about 9/11, and why is it such a key event in unraveling the mysteries about the deep state?
Well, it's the event that formed, number one, the rising police state in America. The TSA and the NDAA, and surveillance and unwarranted online looking at people, and just as significant, if not more significant, is a nonstop series of Middle East wars, which I imagine most of your listeners or viewers have at this point have watched the interview between Amy Goodman and General Wesley Clark, where he said that there was already a plan for 6 wars in the Middle East in 2001, which are now undertaken at the cost of trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's certainly significant. If we didn't have those trillions of dollars being spent out there, we wouldn't have the refugee crisis in Europe. We wouldn't be getting any Muslim blowback, and we'd have money to spend here at home. Maybe we really could make America great again. So 9/11, of course, is also the event that woke up so many people, and it continues to mystify us to a certain extent, but we do know that the government story has been falsified in many ways. So it's something we need to keep using, since it did wake people up so well after 2001. I think it still can today.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I can say it was the catalyst for my own awakening to what was going on at a global scene. I mean, I remember totally buying everything that was sold to me on that day. But what really started waking me up was this connection between Iraq and 9/11. It was like, why are we going to war with Iraq? There's no Al-Qaeda there. I mean, what is this? And then eventually starting to then go backwards and going, what happened on 9/11? I mean, I hear about all these 9/11 truther people. What is this? And I started digging into it, and then there you go. It was like the start of it all, in terms of really peeling back those layers. At least for me, in my generation, I would say the people that who witnessed it. I mean, it was such an event that is forever engraven on your memory if you were old enough to really remember it. So, I mean, the world would definitely changed, at least here in the United States, especially. I mean, really throughout the world, but especially here in the United States. And when you think of, now we have 17 years in between, and you can see what's taken place, and which also has given you, and what you talk about in your article about who did it and how did they do it, we have more evidence and more of a, who's benefiting from this, and we can really start seeing over the 17-year span really who benefited from it. And I was just, I want you to kind of get into, in your article, you talk about how, as you see it, most likely this is an operation that was done by, by Israel. And again, when we say Israel, that's a big, broad word it seems to be encompassing anyone who lives in Israel, which obviously is not what you're after. But can you kind of explain your reasoning behind why you see it as an Israeli operation?
Sure, and I should just modify that a little bit by saying it's an Israeli operation, certainly with a good degree of especially American Zionist cooperation. And one of the things I started off the article by saying is that I think we use a slight misnomer in alt media about 9/11. We say 9/11 was an inside job. I think 9/11 was primarily an outside job, at least when we're talking about the hands-on operational level. And an example I like to use as a comparison is the attack on USS Liberty by Israel. It's certainly true that at the executive U.S. government level of Lyndon Baines Johnson, our president, and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, they cooperated with that attack. They recalled the fighters who were sent to rescue the Liberty, and they ordered a cover-up. But at the hands-on operational level, it was not our own people attacking the U.S. Liberty. It was the Israelis. And if we look at the evidence, I think that we have a pretty comparable situation taking place on 9/11. And so why don't we talk a little about the evidence that that Israel was deeply involved at an operational hands-on level. And I really found a great summary of this evidence is on the Wikispooks article called Israel 9/11 Did It. But some of the examples, of course, are the famous dancing Israelis. And, those guys were noted right on CNN on the day it happened. We didn't know that they were Israeli, but it was reported that some neighbors had spotted 5 men who were celebrating the attack, photographing it, high-fiving each other, flicking a lighter against the background of the burning buildings. They were cheering, and they took off in a white van, and the license plate was written down. The police got them. CNN reported that same day, but then they just disappeared from the scene. Well, it turned out that they were Israelis, and at least 2 were members of Mossad. And there were, in fact, quite a few. There were dozens of Israelis arrested in the wake of 9/11, but they were all let go. Within 2 months, those 5 dancing Israelis were sent home because the guy in charge of the Justice Department's investigation of 9/11 was Michael-Chirtoff, whose mother was a Mossad agent. And his parents were founding members of Israel. Why would you put this guy in charge of the operation? And then we look at airport security, and we see that airport security on 9/11 with the involved airports was Huntsville, USA, a wholly owned subsidiary of ICTS, which was owned by Ezra Haro and Menachem-atta, 2 Israelis. And then you go over to World Trade Center security, you see it's owned by the Kroll associates, Jeremy and Jules, who are hardcore Zionists. And then we have Lucky Silverstein. Larry Silverstein took control of the ownership of the Twin Towers less than 2 months before the attacks. He invested $124 million with his partners, and he got an insurance payout of almost $5 billion. And Lucky Larry was so lucky, he happened to miss 9/11 due to a fortuitous doctor's appointment. And then
what was Larry Silverstein's connection with Benjamin Netanyahu?
Yeah, Lucky Larry was so close to Netanyahu. I'm going to quote the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on that. It said in November 2001, quote, "Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein, not the other way around. Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference what the subject was or where Netanyahu was. He would always call," unquote. And that's in the weeks leading up to 9/11. So there's a direct Israeli connection to Silverstein. Then you've got the only major Israeli firm in the World Trade Center was zim-Israel-Navigation, which had been there for 30 years, but fortuitously pulled out about 2 weeks before the event, saying they wanted to find a place with cheaper rent. Then you've got the Israeli company Odigo, an instant messaging service, which received messages telling all Israelis not to be in the World Trade Center about 2 hours before the attack, and the firm has admitted that. And then you've got P-Tech, which is a software firm linked to Israeli intelligence, which was providing software we're using that day by the FBI, the FAA, and the U.S. Armed Services. And then the executive director of the 9/11 Commission was Philip-Zelikow, who was a dual American-Israeli citizen. And why would you want someone with foreign citizenship to be running the 9/11 Commission? And then you've got, of course, that famous PNAC, Project for a New American Century report in 2000 calling for a new Pearl Harbor. And you have people on that writing that paper, such as Paul Wolfowitz, who was our Deputy Secretary of Defense and lived in Israel as a teenager. And then you've got the guy they call Rabbi Dov Zakheim, the comptroller of the Pentagon. He was in charge of the finances when the famous 2.3 trillion went missing in an announcement voiced by Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, one day before 9/11. And they wrote that paper calling for or helped to write the paper calling for a new 9/11. And the head of our defense policy board in 9/11 was Richard-Perle, who had been caught by the NSA spying for Israel, but was not charged and was left in a significant government position. And the favorite guy I like to mention is the one who is seated behind Mohamed-Atta on Flight 11. That's Danny-Lewin. And I consider him a significant figure in this day. He was a former captain in the IDF in the Sayeret Matkal, which is the Israeli Special Ops, which I believe played a very significant role in 9/11. He had his picture taken 1 year before 9/11, before two panels that look like the Twin Towers. And on his watch, he's got a big smile on his face. He's pointing to his watch. And that watch is a Swatch hijacker watch. That was the name of the watch. It was a hijacker model. And the minute hand, second hand, hour hand, and date were all set to the 11. And if you think that's a coincidence, the odds of that happening by chance are more than 20,000 to 1. And where was Danny-Lewin on 9/11? Row 9 of Flight 11. Now, there's something going on there that the coincidence just can't explain. Yeah. And that's just a sampling of evidence that 9/11 was undertaken by Israelis. And you'll find a lot more data, again, on that Wikispooks article called 9/11, Israel Did It.
Can you talk about then how Israel benefits from this? I mean, there's some obvious glaring points to this, but can you maybe reiterate it for anyone who wouldn't understand this? Why would Israel want this to happen?
Well, Israel is, of course, was pronounced our ally in all of this, and Israel actually gets more military aid than all the countries of Africa combined from us. And in terms of benefits, that's a very significant question, because if you're a police detective and you're trying to solve a crime, this was a crime of incomparable magnitude. A police detective, one of the first things they do when they try to figure out a logical suspect, they'll say, who benefited? I mean, did somebody have an insurance policy who benefited from the, So did Israel benefit? You bet. Not only did they get a whole bunch of more military aid, but we took out their enemies one by one. Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein and Omar Gaddafi, and we're bombing Syria, and we destabilized Egypt, and now of course Yemen's going on, and the entire surrounding region in the Middle East, with Iran reputedly next on the hit list, is being destabilized, and that coordinates with Israel's own plan. It's called the Yinon Plan, which if you look up on Global Research, the article called Greater Israel, they talk about how Israel has a plan to destabilize all of its neighbors through what's called balkanization, by dividing them up. In fact, this just came out recently. It was hooked into an article I saw on Twitter, how American diplomats have been discussing dividing up Syria now into different portions, a northern portion and a southern portion, and a Kurd portion. And the purpose is that Israel feels that if all of its enemies are divided into these tiny little sub-nations, then they won't have trouble squelching any one of them if they get out of line. And that's a long-term Rothschild plan, just to make it a little clear to people why the U.S. deep state and Israel is interested in that. Israel is envisioned as being the capital of the world government, which the deep state has been planning, the Rothschilds have been planning for a long time. That is where they want it to be centered. That is even prophesied in the Bible. It's a Luciferian plan. A lot of Americans think they've been deluded into believing that Israel is the reborn biblical Israel, that it's godly. That was not created by God. It was created by the Rothschilds, starting with the Balfour Declaration addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild in 1917, and even going back to 1829. For we know as early as then, the Rothschilds were buying up land in Palestine for the formulation, for the implementation of this long-term plan. So that's what's going on there. That's who benefited. And we're undertaking the Greater Israel Yinon plan as a direct result of 9/11, as well as the police state here in America.
So let's just get it out of the way. Answer the anti-Semitic accusations that you'll get from talking like this. Let's just talk about it, and so we can clear it up and move on.
Well, I'm half Jewish myself. The Perloff family was Jewish. We came from Russia in 1904, which is about the time of one of the pogroms that was going on. So my ancestors were Jewish. And so I am not motivated by racism or anti-Semitism. We're just talking geopolitical facts here, documentable historical facts. There is no racist motive whatsoever in our conversation here. I wish it wasn't Israel, but unfortunately that is the fact. And so we're looking at this through an objective lens. We're trying to look at this the way a good jury would look at a case, without prejudice. So
absolutely.
There you go. This is not from anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and I always say, the Jewish people have been, tricked and bamboozled just like everybody else. So I mean, this is a lie on a very huge level that's been told to everyone, including the Jews. So the normal Jewish people, just like you and me, who it doesn't really matter what their belief in the Great Spirit is. This is a brainwashing on a very big level, and it's seen here in America. I mean, right after 9/11, how many Americans were anti-Islam after that? It worked.
Right.
And this divide and conquer has been taking place over and over and over. Now everyone hates each other, and it's all the major religions now seem to be at each other's necks over these type of events. And many of them, as a lot of your work has shown, is based on total lies. And so we've been tricked. And so we're all on the same team here. Just because you're saying Israel, that doesn't even necessarily mean every single politician in Israel is in on it. This could be just like here in the United States. It could be a faction and an underground faction, of course. I mean, the Mossad, I'm sure, have dark agents just like we do in the CIA, obviously, and so and I'm sure they have good guys working with them as well. But it's one of those things. Whenever we talk about any of this, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This isn't all or nothing. This is a very fluid, mixed bag of people we're talking about.
Very true. And some of the best exposers of the New World Order have been Jewish, such as Henry Mackow, Brother Nathaniel, Benjamin Friedman, Myron Fagan, going back in time, have been exposers of this. So we're not generalizing about a group of people, but we're talking about certain ones within, especially that Talmudic, we might call a Jewish supremacist Zionist core. But certainly, absolutely not all Jewish people. My father himself didn't have the slightest who was Jewish, didn't have the slightest interest in the Rothschilds or Israel or any of that.
Yeah. Let's move on to we described the who. Now let's describe the how. And you bring up in your article how there's three major schools of thought on how this took place, and I was wondering if you could kind of go over those three, and as you go on in the article, you explain why you support, you see it as the most likely scenario is that it was a nuclear, this was a nuclear event. But can you explain the three trains of thoughts that we have within the 9/11 community?
And most of your listeners and viewers will be familiar with these, the nanothermite which has been suggested by Dr. Stephen Jones and is favored by architects and engineers from 9/11 Truth. The directed energy weapons advocated by Dr. Judy-Wood, and the nuclear. And I'll say that after watching some of these California fires, I'm a little more impressed by the evidence for directed energy. And I think that perhaps what happened on 9/11 was that they were using, obviously they were using multiple means. We know that there were fires in those buildings. But I was contacted, I would not have written this article if I had not been, you got a remote for that dog? I've got a cat, he may chime in too. I was contacted by people overseas who were very expert in nuclear weapons. And I just want to clarify, these people are not from Russia and they're not Israeli whistleblowers, but they were overseas and they had a lot of expertise in nukes. And I would not have written my original longer post, which is called To 9/11 and Beyond, the Rothschild Israeli Obsession with Nuclear Weapons, if I had not been contacted and certain things had been pointed out to me. But in this most recent article, more recent article called 9/11 Simplified, I gave what I call my top 10 reasons why I believe this is a nuclear event. And I believe it will give some clarification if I mention where these nukes were placed according to these individuals. And these nukes would have been in the service pits of elevator 50. Elevator 50 was the only elevator that ran the full length of both Twin Towers. It was in the sub basement. Its elevator pits were the only pits carved into the bedrock below the World Trade Center, which meant that a nuclear blast there, it would be contained by the bedrock in its sideways and downward force, but it would shoot up through the elevator shaft, spreading outwards. This was the ideal place to situate a suitcase nuke, which is a nuke that's small enough to carry in a backpack. But let's give the top 10 reasons why we believe this is a nuclear event. And again, not denying that when the plane hit, there were other explosives, not denying the possibility of there being thermite at those levels. There obviously were conventional explosions in the basements, which I can elaborate on, by the way, in terms of this nuclear scenario. There were conventional explosions that preceded the taking downs of the buildings, not denying the possibility of directed energy. But if you look at the North Tower exploding, most people, for some reason, mostly we see the South Tower, which had that boom, 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 boom. But if you look at the North Tower, you can see that when it went down, it was engulfed with flame. I mean, it was engulfed with flame. It exploded. And there was really no sequential boom, 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 which people use as a pancaking explanation with the second tower. This is the North Tower, the second one that quote unquote collapsed. It was a huge explosion that took place. Well, let's talk about these top 10 reasons. Number one, thyroid cancer. The type of cancer that first responders get most often in comparison to its expected rate is thyroid cancer. That's a signature of a nuclear bomb. It's the only known environmental cause of thyroid cancer. It is caused because a nuclear bomb will emit iodine-131, which embeds into the thyroid, which is why some people keep potassium iodide tablets on hand, just in case there's a nuclear attack. That's reason number one. Number two is the World Trade Center dust samples, which were examined by the U.S. Geological Survey, showed inexplicable amounts of products of nuclear fission, and that included uranium and cadmium and thorium and strontium. And there was an excellent book on this. It was called Ground Zero, The Nuclear Demolition of the World Trade Center, published in 2006 by William Cahill. Very interesting that after that book came out, suddenly the nanothermite and the directed energy got a lot more attention. But after I published my article, Cahill's book was scrubbed from the internet. But I've linked to it now from the Wayback Machine, so people can still read it. Reason number three, the molten steel. Fires burned underneath the World Trade Center for more than 3 months. A nuclear event is extremely hot. In fact, at the very epicenter of a nuclear explosion, you stop me at any time, by the way, it reaches millions of degrees, and then the temperature will lower as you get away from that epicenter. But a nuclear event, that's a hot event. This is a hot event. I've talked to people, even on a radio show, was caught in that nuclear dust cloud on 9/11. They talk about how hot it was. Okay, reason number 4, the towers didn't fall, they exploded. And some of the evidence for this, you'll see multi-ton chunks of the World Trade Center that flew hundreds of feet and knocked over the Winter Garden atrium and embedded themselves in the American Express building. And that's not a collapse, that's an explosion. And you don't need a eccentric, out of this world weapon to explain this. A nuclear bomb is the most powerful explosive known to man. It has the force to throw those big chunks, all those hundreds of feet. Reason number 5, the inner contents, and Judy-Wood talks about this, but the inner contents of the World Trade Center were vaporized. No toilets survived. Only one of 10,000 filing cabinets survived. No computers survived. No furniture survived. And of course, no people survived inside. The only bodies found were people who had jumped prior to the explosions. And a nuclear bomb would do that because of the power of its explosion. And it's not something that goes bang, it's done. A nuclear explosion is the explosion that keeps on giving. It keeps on continuing for several seconds, and it will inflict that level of energy. Number 6.
Wait, real quick,
is,
you know, what are they making passports out of? Because, man, it seems like passports can survive this.
Well, somebody sent me, tweeted things that they should give firefighters uniforms made of Muslim hijacker passports because they're indestructible. You know,
exactly.
They won't destroy a passport, but they will destroy all toilets and filing cabinets. And that, of course, is one of the. I'm talking about the less famous, some of the less famous aspects that, of course, Building 7, hijacker passports. These are some of the things that most of you probably already know.
Sure.
Number 7, in terms of evidence for a nuclear blast, is the damage to the rest of the World Trade Center. The theory here is, again, that the nukes were suitcase nukes in the service pits at the lowest point of the World Trade Center. What most people don't know is that underground, the entire World Trade Center was connected by a storm drainage system 3 feet wide. And that system connected to the lowest point, to these service pits of elevated 50, because you want to put your drainage system into where water will go. It goes to the lowest point when you have a flooding situation. So that what we think happened to these other buildings, that, you know, buildings 5, 6, 7, they were cratered out and burnt out, but they didn't collapse, is that they were suffering the secondary effects of these nuclear blasts, which were taking out the Twin Towers, which, by the way, there were 2 sets of these underground systems, one connected to Tower 1 and one connected to Tower 2. Barry Jennings was an emergency coordinator for the New York Housing Authority, who survived on 9/11. He was in Building 7, and he was trying to escape it. And as he went down the stairs, he said there was an enormous explosion bottom up in Building 7, which took out the stairwell beneath him. He had to retreat with his colleague back upstairs. They were rescued by the New York Fire Department eventually. But what would cause a explosion from the bottom up that doesn't destroy the building? Well, the nuke, again, it's this underground system. I don't think that's directed energy doing that, although I do think there's evidence for directed energy. But a bottom-up explosion would be accounted for by this underground system. And one of the evidences for this, by the way, Clint, and you'll see this in my articles, especially the one on called 9/11, the Rothschild Israeli obsession with nuclear weapons. I've got footage there, and you'll see as the first tower collapses, you will see geysers bursting out of the ground at the World Trade Center. These geysers start as water, and then they become smoke. And that is the underground system. The explosion is traveling underground. Okay, reason number 8, the dust cloud. Now, I know that when a building collapses, there will be a dust cloud, but people still watch from a couple blocks away, usually when a building, 3 blocks away when a building collapses. This dust cloud had a life of its own. And if you watch on YouTube, just look for video footage of U.S. nuclear tests. They don't just create a mushroom cloud, which would have, of course, been diminished by the fact that it was inside a building on 9/11. But there was this tremendous, sprawling, ground-level dust cloud, which you will see also takes place with a nuclear event. That's reason number 8. Reason number 9, this goes out of the physical evidence, but Susan-Lindauer was an employee of the CIA. She was second cousin of Andrew Card, who was the chief of staff for George Bush. She received information in the CIA that there was going to be an attack on the World Trade Center involving planes and involving the use of a mini nuke. She tried to warn the Justice Department. John Ashcroft didn't want to hear about it. She stayed up all night outside Andrew Card's home, hoping to get his attention to warn him about the attack. She was thrown in prison for her trouble. She's written a book called Extreme Prejudice. She's now out of prison. She has her own radio show on Truth Frequency Radio. But Susan has said that the advance information was they were going to use mini nukes. Okay, so I consider that a piece of evidence. And let's see if I can get this up here. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote a book in 1995. I have it here. It's Fighting Terrorism. And here's what he predicted, okay, in 1995. Such groups, he's talking about Islamic groups, nullify in large measure the need to have air power or intercontinental missiles as delivery systems for an Islamic nuclear payload. They will be the delivery system. In the worst of such scenarios, the consequences could be not a car bomb, but a nuclear bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. Unquote, Benjamin Netanyahu. And I want to play you a clip from Benjamin Netanyahu talking to Tom Brokaw about this 2 days after 9/11.
Handle. The main point that I want to stress is that we don't approach this as a small problem of Israel or a small problem of America vis-a-vis bin Laden, because what we have here is something far worse. You know, in 1995, I wrote a book called Fighting Terrorism, and I said that if we don't arrest the tide of Islamic militant terrorism, militant Islamic terrorism, then the next thing that will be is not a car bomb in the World Trade Center, but a nuclear bomb. Now, it wasn't a nuclear bomb. It was a 350-ton conventional bomb.
So there's Benjamin Netanyahu really kind of teasing us with the fact that he knows it was a nuclear bomb. And he says conventional bomb. But again, how would he know it's conventional bomb? Supposedly it was airplanes that took down the World Trade Center. That's 2 days after 9/11. And so those are my top 10 reasons for thinking that again, I do believe conventional explosions, very possibly thermite. You know, I had somebody write me, this is the pilot who I wrote, ended up writing a second article with called The Conversation with the Pilot about 9/11. He thought that perhaps, you know, that molten steel you see pouring out of the side there, they wanted thermite melting steel at the level of plane strikes to convince people that jet fuel does burn, does melt steel, you know. He thinks maybe that was part of the setup, and I think that's a pretty good insight. But that's my top 10 reasons for thinking that the event that quote unquote collapsed the building was nuclear, not denying these other phenomena that the 9/11 movement talks about.
Critics will often bring up the fact that there was a lack of radiation found, you know, around the site of the event. Can you talk to that?
Yes, the people who wrote me were expert in nukes. Said you have different types of nuclear weapons, and of course the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs had lots of radiation, but atomic bombs consist of a combination of fusion and fission. You know, fission, you're breaking atoms apart. Fusion, you're fusing them, nuclear particles together. If you have a bomb that's high in fusion, it'll have a limited amount of radiation. And during the Cold War, we started to develop battlefield nukes, strategic nukes, which have low radiation. The idea is if you set off a nuke during a battlefield war, you don't want the radiation to contaminate your own soldiers. So you have minimum radiation. They call these MRRs today, minimal residual radiation nukes. In fact, Dr. Edward Teller said they hope to eventually develop a completely clean nuke, although apparently they, as far as we know, they never developed that. But what kind of nuke do you think Israel would stockpile? Of course, if Israel gets into a war with its neighbor or any of its neighbors, we don't know what kind of nukes they stockpile because they keep that an ironclad secret. But obviously they would want low radiation nukes because they don't want blowback to Tel Aviv. So we think that these suitcase nukes would have been minimal residual radiation nukes, but there's some other factors. Hurricane Erin was right off the coast. That would have, as a low pressure system, would have pulled the air of New York City into it. And you're probably familiar with Hurricane Erin. Judy-Wood talks about it a lot. It was headed for New York City. 9/11, it stopped, and then suddenly headed up to Greenland. it would have taken a lot of the radiation with it because it would have pulled air out of the radiation out of the atmosphere. Also, it rained after 9/11, even though it was a clear day that day. There was heavy rain in New York City after that, which would have minimized radiation. Plus, Jim Fetzer pointed this out in an interview I did with him, that all the dirt that Giuliani was pouring on the World Trade Center to nullify the smoke and fire would have minimized radiation as well. So there's 4 different factors that would have cut radiation down after 9/11.
James, can you talk about the pictures that are all over the internet about these Israeli art students that were working up in the same area where the planes entered? I don't remember all the details as to which towers they were working in or whatnot. But I think you know what I'm talking about in terms of those students.
There were art students. It was covered in the New York Times, and this is not fresh in my mind to talk about right now. But they were working at just about the exact place where one of the plane strikes took place. I think it was around the 93rd floor, and they cut their way to the edge of the building. And there's footage of them too when they completed their "quote unquote" art project, which pictures that were published in Europe showed these art students, and there's boxes of fuses behind them. And what are art students doing with fuses? They also have some equipment that they're wearing, which is equipment that mountain hikers would use to climb mountains, and just a lot of strange stuff going on. So it appears that these people, since they're working at the same level of the airplane strikes, were perhaps preparing the building in some way for what was going to happen on 9/11, because this is just a few months before 9/11 happened. Very strange that they would cut their way and actually open up the holes in the side of the building, right where the planes came.
Which then leads to this theory that there were no planes, and you talk about this in your article about originally when you had first heard of the no plane theory, that it was kind of a bridge too far for you, and then as you kind of did more research into it, you started realizing that the story that these two airliners crashed into the World Trade Center was a real difficult task to pull off. And again, you've talked to many commercial jet pilots who have now who've backed up this claim that this is a real difficult thing for especially a couple of guys who were only flying small aircraft. They'd never even flown these large commercial jets before, and then to bring them down into a low elevation, a low altitude, and to crash them full speed into these buildings is potentially an impossibility. I don't know. Can you talk about the no plane theory? And I know some people might hear it and it's just they might start glitching out over it because it seems too difficult to comprehend. But can you kind of go over this? And this is a big part of your article, and you go heavily into this, and it's something that we should all really consider because there's some glaring evidence pointing towards something far different that took place.
Right. I won't necessarily say no planes, but certainly not the planes we were told.
Yeah. And
what kind of started me looking at this, when I first heard no planes, again, I thought, oh, that's ridiculous. Is this cognitive dissonance? Is this a fakery? And people may be right if we take a completely no plane approach, but I am going to address that. But what started me looking at this more seriously was Shanksville and the Pentagon. Shanksville, you've got this big hole and no bodies and none of the normal plane wreckage you see in other plane crashes.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire, just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet.
And, Chris Berlin went out to investigate, tried to talk to the local news reporter who would talk to it, and some military official came out and told him that that person was not available and that the hole in Shanksville and somebody swallowed up the plane. And in my article, I have some footage that day, early that day, where the news reporters are talking about there's nothing there but a hole, no evidence of a plane at all, no wreckage, which you just don't see that in normal plane crashes. And then, of course, the Pentagon. I'm going to quote Lieutenant Colonel Karen, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, Kwiatkowski, PhD, who was at the Pentagon that day. And she's been a truther, even though she's ex-Air Force. She said this, quote, "There was a dearth of visible debris on the relatively unmarked Pentagon lawn where I stood only minutes after the impact. Beyond this strange absence of airliner debris, there was no sign of the kind of damage to the Pentagon structure one would expect for the impact of a large airliner. This visible evidence or lack thereof may also have been apparent to the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who, in an unfortunate slip of the tongue, referred to the aircraft that slammed into the Pentagon as a missile," unquote, Lieutenant Colonel Kwiatkowski. And another clip that I have in my articles is from the one from April-gallup. She was working in the Pentagon when the explosion occurred. She and several colleagues walked out right through that big hole in the Pentagon where the plane allegedly hit before the collapse, roof collapse occurred. She said there was no sign of an airplane, no airplane wreckage, no bodies from no passenger bodies, no seat cushions, no luggage, nothing you expect from an airplane. Of course, people have noted that the plane would have had to pull out of a sharp decline, which an commercial aircraft just can't do, and flown perfectly level to the airplane, to the Pentagon lawn without scuffing it, in order to enter the first floor where all the accountants were working on those missing 2.3 trillion and conveniently died the day after it had been announced. And you've also got Major General Albert Stubblebine of U.S. Army intelligence talking about this being, to him, obviously a missile because there's no plane wing marks on the Pentagon. So there's significant personnel and evidence that we did not have a normal craft crashing in Shanksville in the Pentagon. So this now raises the question of what really hit the Twin Towers, because most people, the reason they will scoff at the idea that the airliners didn't hit the Twin Towers is everybody saw that second plane coming in, the alleged Flight 175. All eyes were trained on the Twin Towers. It was caught on camera by many people, and there were certainly tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of direct eyewitnesses. So, but let's talk about why it could not have been Flight 175, the second plane that hit the South Tower. Reason number one, if you look at the images of the plane, it clearly has an object on its underside. It's about the size of a cruise missile. And some people have tried to naysay that by saying it's just paint. But well, you can maybe argue that if you're looking at a photo taken directly underneath, but you'll take a photo that's taken obliquely, it's clearly three-dimensional. And the pilot, I call him Pilot A, he's an active Airbus pilot who trained pilots for many years for a commercial flight, pointing out to me that it's impossible for something like that to be loaded on at Logan Airport. Not only is the maintenance crew going to notice it, but it's mandatory for the pilot or co-pilot to do a complete walk around of an aircraft before takeoff. They're going to notice the missile there or whatever this pod was. They're not going to take off from Logan. And whoever rigged it on 9/11 is not going to hope that it's not going to be noticed. So that cannot be Flight 175. But there are other reasons as well. According to Wikipedia, Flight 175 was going 590 miles per hour. Now, the max flying speed, and you've already begun to touch on this, but the max flying speed at ground level for a Boeing 767 is 424 miles per hour, which is 170 miles less. If you start to try to reach those altitudes, the plane becomes totally uncontrollable. And I embedded a clip from pilots for 9/11 Truth, and they pointed out that even experienced Boeing pilots on flight simulators could not hit the World Trade Center at those speeds. Now, if they had thousands of hours of experience flying Boeings, so how does a Arab pilot who's simply been trained on twin-engine planes, as little twin-engine Cessnas, can't control them, flunks out of flight school, never been in a Boeing cockpit before, and he can do what experienced Boeing pilots can't do and make bullseye hits. 9/11, Colin, I think this is significant. 9/11, the hits had to be guaranteed. The bullseye, if they just clipped the World Trade Center with their wings, the plane crashes someplace else, the whole scenario has to be called off. You can't collapse the World Trade Center based on a wing clip. So they had to guarantee bullseye hits, and there's no way that even an experienced pilot could do that. Other reasons, the penetration. You've seen this, of course, but when you see that second plane going into the south tower, it simply vanishes into the tower. The wings don't break off. The nose doesn't crumple, but it's hitting 14-inch thick steel columns. Now, if you look at pictures of planes that have hit birds, they've had their noses completely crumpled. And this is something that Pilot A pointed out to me. He said that you may think that these planes are big and powerful, but essentially they're hollow tubes. They're like, he called them flying tubes of aluminum tinfoil. They're hollow inside. They don't have this battering ram impact that we've been led to believe. And another thing that he pointed out is, you've got these at least two sets of video that captures the nose of the plane coming out the other side, which is impossible. The nose would have been totally destroyed by all those internal steel columns. And some people have tried to argue that image of the nose coming out the other side is simply smoke. But no, when you look at it, it is clearly defined. It has the shape of an airplane nose, which means we're looking at some kind of graphic, whether it was added before the fact or after the fact. But those are some of the reasons why it's impossible.
Yeah, and in your article, you showed that video where the I can't remember who did the video, but they did a total match of the front of the plane right before it went through the building, and then they superimposed it on that smoke coming out the other side, and it was literally exactly an exact match. Which is, and as you said, there's no way that cone of the front of the plane could have gone through all that steel and remained intact.
It could not have survived. So something's going on there that obviously does not match the official story. So this leaves us with the question, okay, if Flight 175 and, I'll just mention this, by the way, Flight 11, we only have that one video, the first plane hitting, the one where they were taping the firemen in the street, and the camera panned up and it caught this image, which is very unclear, but there's an explosion. We see what is supposed to be Flight 11 hitting the first tower. I was contacted by somebody who said he was in New York City unloading his van and he saw that first plane hit. And he said, it was remarkable. He said that the plane seemed to vanish entirely inside the building before there was an explosion. He said it was as if the plane was flying into a hangar. But he also said to me he was convinced that this was a real plane. How that correlates with the saying that it went all the way. He said that the rear fin had disappeared into the building before there was any explosion, and that just does not match up with what we know about how aircraft behave. The wings should have clipped off. The tail, which is made of aluminum, should have clipped off. All right, so we're left with a couple of possibilities of what this could have been. And those two possibilities are either a cloaked missile or a drone. And some people laugh at the idea of a cloaked missile, but I want to mention some of the reasons why this is actually credible. A missile is very controllable. It can be precisely guided. It's got internal GPS. It can have a camera built into the cone. Also, unlike a plane, its nose is hardened for penetration, so it can go right inside. It does not have the problem of the G-forces. So at that high speed, which it can attain and a plane cannot, it can be perfectly controlled. It's not going to be thrown off like a plane would be. Also, military personnel have lots of experience with missiles and driving them and flying them into buildings. They don't have much experience with flying planes into buildings. So there's some evidence. And well, people say, well, what did people see then? And the answer is that the U.S. had developed cloaking technology to project the image of an aircraft. And this goes back to the 1990s. And on the Air Force's own website, they had and we have pictures of this, they have what they call the airborne holographic projector. And I'll quote the Air Force's own site. It says, quote, the holographic projector displays a three-dimensional visual image in a desired location. The projector can be used for psychological operations and strategic management of perception. It's also useful for optical deception and cloaking, providing a distraction when engaging an unsophisticated adversary. Capabilities: precision projection of a 3D visual image into a selected area, supports PSYOP and strategic deception management. And it goes on. But anyway, it shows a picture of an aircraft image being projected. And this is to deceive the enemy's aircraft gunners. They're going to be shooting at a non-existent plane while the real plane is making the attack. So they did have this capability in the 90s. It is possible. And as far as the Israelis go, this I find very interesting. Israel, up until 1999, had these antiquated subs from the 1970s. But in 1999, they acquired their first Dolphin-class subs, which can fire cruise missiles. And in the year 2000, and this from mainstream sources, the U.S. Navy observed the Israeli Navy was in the Indian Ocean was test firing its cruise missiles from subs. That means they did have the ability. They did have the ability to cloak a missile. Well, according to the declassified Defense Department document from 1987, Critical Technology Assessment in Israel, it says that the Israeli firm El-Op was developing holographic technology with, quote, stealth applications, unquote. So did they have the ability to launch a cruise missile like we cloaked as an aircraft in 9/11? I don't know. But if we're looking at an Israel did it scenario, that's something that I think deserves some consideration when you add, especially when you add in the Israeli art students and all that other evidence against Israel we mentioned. I want to mention the possibility of drones as well, but let me pause here for any comment you may have, Clint.
No, I mean, actually, I think drones is the right way to go because, you know, again, we saw what we saw. There were wings, but as you said, even with Flight 175, there was something underneath the fuselage of the plane that looked exactly the same size of a missile. And so, how could that be, right? I mean, it seems impossible that wouldn't have been seen at the airport. So, what are we dealing with? I mean, could there be a cloaking device on that missile, and it was actually the rest of the missile was the only real thing we saw there? And then if it was a drone, a winged drone, could we have actually could they have actually accurately hit the buildings with a drone? Because, you know, again, same with wings, you're still going to get some of that G-force that the pilots were talking about in your article, the resistance to accurately hit that spot. Even with a drone, it seems a little less likely than an actual missile. Correct?
Yes, so both the missile and the drone have their own advantages and their possibilities. The drone, one of the things that is appealing about the drone is that the U.S. had developed this program called Operation Northwoods in 1962, and it was a scenario that the chief of staff presented to President Kennedy. It was never enacted, but the idea was to stage a false flag to justify an invasion of Cuba. What they envisioned was switching a drone for a commercial airliner, blowing up the drone. The commercial airliner would land at a military base, disembark its passengers, and then the drone, which would be claimed to be the real plane, would be used to justify U.S. attack. Now, one of the interesting things about the planes on 9/11, flights 11 and 175, is they almost crisscross. They came close to hitting each other. It was right over Stewart Air Base. So some people think that would have been the logical moment to launch two drones that flew in their wake and then were substituted for the planes. That sounds pretty logical. Another thing in favor of the drones, and this is something that the pilot pointed out to me. You look at the images of the two quote unquote plane strikes. It looks plane shaped. And one of the explanations for that as well, it was they used explosives. But the problem is that if you look at where the wings hit, and again, there's problems with wings going through steel, but the metal is bent inward. And so if it's a missile isn't that broad. How do you get that bending inward? And that's something that's hung me up. You know, I've wanted to write a book on 9/11 to kind of recapitulate all this, but I don't want to write a book that would mislead people in any way. So I'm still trying to resolve this issue of drone versus missile. I will say this much, that some people have said that a drone would also explain some of the aircraft debris that was found. What's very, very interesting is that all aircraft, all the parts have serial numbers, And they did find an engine or part of an engine. They found part of a fuselage. They found a wheel. But all that stuff should have serial numbers. Why is it that in no case has the government matched the serial numbers to those planes? Because the serial numbers are unique. You could track it to the log books, and you could prove that those aircraft parts did in fact come from the original aircrafts as claimed. But the government has never done that, never dared match any part by its serial number to the planes. A drone would explain it. If it's missiles, then you're talking about the planting of evidence. And I believe that is within the realm of credibility when you consider that there was very limited aircraft debris. And don't forget that those dancing Israelis moved for a moving company, which has big trucks, strong guys, and dollies, which during the smoke and confusion of 9/11 could have dropped off some debris. So that's within the realm of possibility too. But the problems with a drone, you've already pointed this out, is how does it fly through steel any better than an airplane? What about those G-forces? How can you control it? It has to be a very specialized drone. And I have to ask how do they practice this thing? I mean, they would have had to practice this thing a few times to make sure they had it perfect. And I didn't know where you practice flying drones into buildings or anything else. Some people say, well, maybe they practice in Area 51, but any engineers who worked on this would have recognized that their project had been used on 9/11. They would have had to. You'd have to be taking a chance that anybody who worked on the development of these drones would have maintained complete silence after 9/11 and said, no, that was not one of our planes. So I don't know. I'm still kind of caught between these two possibilities. They both have their advantages and their disadvantages. Any thoughts of your own on Clint? Because I'm really not decided about it.
Well, I'm not either. In fact, the reason I even do this whole YouTube channel is that I have a lot more questions than answers, and so that's why I love talking to guys like you, and just putting these perspectives out there. I mean, I can definitely. I mean, like many, we smell something way off, and I guess the onus is on us to find the proof. But yet, even with the proof, it seems like it doesn't really matter. I mean, has the government? I mean, to the best of your knowledge, James, has the government ever commented on the fact that these serial numbers have never been matched up?
No, they don't get into that at all. It's interesting, years later, this is pretty recent, they found a piece of landing gear. CNN did a piece on that, and it said this landing gear had a serial number on it. Well, if you want to know what plane it came from, just match that unique serial number, find out if it came from one of the 9/11 planes. One of the strange things about that piece of landing gear is it had a rope attached to it. Why was there a rope attached to it? That is not normal. But it evidently was a relic of 9/11, but the government made no attempt to match that serial number. I've never heard of them attempting to do that, but it would be an easy way to prove 9/11 if you could really prove to people that those aircraft debris parts had the right serial numbers.
So with this idea that the actual planes of 175 and 11 were not the actual planes that flew into those buildings, then the question is what happened to those planes and the passengers on them? Can you kind of go into the theories that, again, this of course is in the more of the theoretical realm, because in many ways there's a lack of evidence, direct evidence towards any of this. But can you kind of go take us down some of those ideas that actually would make sense?
In my article 9/11 Simplified, I introduced a completely different concept to what the 9/11 Truth Movement has used or theorized until now, and I want to comment that after this article was published, not only did they scrub William Cahill's book, but my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, they raised the cover price. They normally sold it for about $15.76, nicely discounted from the cover price of $19.95. They immediately raised it to over $19. My other books were all raised to full cover price. They now sell it at $19.95 full cover price, which does not increase my royalty, by the way. That's a fixed royalty. But it makes the book as inaccessible as possible. The Kindle version, which has a fixed price, they took that book down. They suspended it for ludicrous reasons. There was one typo, 2 maps that had fine print, and in the end notes there were some hyperlinks that expired, because you link to a newspaper article, eventually it disappears from the web. That's expected. But they took it down for ludicrous reasons, standards that they do not apply to other books. The one typographical error, we're talking about a 341-page book, was a space missing between two words. Even they had to admit that the maps with fine print, there was no way to correct them. It was not a problem. So there was definitely a takedown, and I think it was related to this article, and I think it may have been related to the idea I'm going to discuss next, which is the possibility that the planes really were physically hijacked, but not by Arabs, but by Israeli special ops. Okay, so I think that we've taken a wrong turn in the truth movement. We know that there was a lot of setting up of the Muslims did this scenario prior to 9/11. We know that the night before 9/11, we had these guys going to Chuckham's Oyster Bar and the Pink Pony and Red Eye Jack Sports Bar, and they were buying lap dances, and they were cursing and leaving behind their business card, their credit card ID. They left behind a Koran at the strip club, which is just nonsense. They were supposed to believe these guys were devout Muslim fundamentalists. Nobody takes their Koran to a strip club. It just doesn't happen. But it does fit the scenario of somebody trying to plant evidence, okay? And it was matched by other planted evidence. At Logan Airport, you had two cars. Cars with a car with a Koran and a flight training manual. So you put those together. You say, okay, these guys are Muslims at a flight training school, okay? And then Mohamed-Atta's luggage fortuitously did not make it onto Flight 11. And from that luggage, the FBI got the names of all the alleged hijackers. So convenient, that it didn't get onto the plane. And why would he bring luggage on a suicide mission anyway? It just doesn't make any sense, okay? And these things are well known in the truth movement. Then it turned out that about half the hijackers turned up alive. And even Robert Mueller, Robert Mueller was in charge of the FBI investigation at that time. But even he admitted publicly that it appeared that many of the hijackers used stolen IDs. He said some of the hijackers, but the FBI never issued corrections, and the 9/11 Commission was never interested in finding out the true identity of the original hijackers, and that narrative was just kept going. And of course, we also learned that the alleged hijackers, were incompetent pilots. There's no way they could have carried this off. So the 9/11 truth movement, we started to pursue another scenario. We said, okay, no hijackers have ever boarded the plane. No hijackers, so we started looking at electronic hijacking. And we started going to scenarios like, the electronic hijacking, all the phone calls were faked. These passengers and flight attendants were really working with the CIA, who gave them new identities and paid them $1 million and moved them someplace, witness protection program type stuff. And we started to blame the families, say they're in it too, because they got phone calls from loved ones. Or we say that the CIA morphed their voices. And these are all things I've seriously looked at. I mentioned this stuff in my own book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, as conceivable explanations for what happened that day. But one of the things that I learned from the guy I call Paladé, those planes could not have been electronically hijacked. Let's talk about why that is. On a 757 or 767, the flight is controlled manually. There is a control yoke, there are pedals, cables that control the ailerons, the elevators, the rudders. It's not computer regulated. To hijack a plane electronically, you need a computer regulated plane. And they do have them now. They call them fly-by-wire planes. The Boeing 777 is fly-by-wire. MH370, that plane that mysteriously vanished, the Malaysian plane, that was a computer regulated plane. That could have been electronically hijacked. But on 9/11, those planes were not computer regulated in their flight. Now, I asked the pilot, by the way, I said, earlier that year, the U.S. Air Force had an unmanned pilot that landed in unpiloted plane that landed in Australia. So couldn't they have done that with these, Flight 11, Flight 175? He said to do that, first of all, you have to have an ILS. It's an instrument landing system inside the planes. You also need an array of antenna at the airport. You would need an array of antenna to connect with at the World Trade Center. He said also there's a margin of error of about 500 feet. He says there's no way, there's just no way that that could have been done to these planes on 9/11. These planes could not have been electronically hijacked. Now, if you look back, there was a TV show called The Lone Gunman. And in March of 2001, they had an episode, there's their pilot episode, where an aircraft is electronically hijacked, a 727, and the terrorists are planning to remotely fly the plane into the World Trade Center, of all things. And on the TV show, the heroes, at the last minute, they break the codes and they save the plane. It flies over the World Trade Center. The month after 9/11, there was a guy named Joe Vials who also proposed the idea of electronic hijacking, which caught fire. I quoted the guy in my own 9/11 writings in my book, Truth is the Lonely Warrior. So this is a very popular idea that got planted in our consciousness, but in reality, it was technically not feasible. Now, I just want to ask you a question, Clint. If you were on an airplane, just a regular flight, what would make you more comfortable? Having two real pilots at the controls or having the plane flown electronically?
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, definitely human beings, right?
Right. And if you're you want to hijack these planes, which is, I believe that the planes were hijacked and that the phone calls were real, you want real hijackers. This is something that really caught my attention. It was in the September 21st, 2001 London Telegraph, quote, accounts from the other doomed planes indicate that the hijackers encouraged people to call their families and tell them what was happening, unquote. And I'm looking at this, I'm saying, why would hijackers tell the victims to call their families? It's to continue that narrative that they're set up with this planted evidence. They want the Muslim hijacker narrative established. These are Israeli special ops. They've boarded the plane. They have boarded the plane on their Muslim ID, Arabic ID. They're dark-skinned. They know Arabic, and they want to plant in people's consciousness the idea that this is a Muslim hijacking taking place. This is also one reason why they weren't patrolling the aisles. They weren't guarding the passengers. They wanted to feel perfectly free to pick up those earphones and call home. I should mention cell phones. There were actually no cell phone calls for the two planes that hit the Twin Towers. The cell phone service was down in New York City that day. Those calls came from airphones. Some people said that American Airlines, I got to go recheck my data to make sure I got the right airline, that American Airlines had stopped using its airphones. That was not until the year after 9/11. One thing that I learned from my flight attendant friend, Mary Ellen Moore, she's the co-producer of my movie Shadowing, which is a primer on the New World Order. She's a career flight attendant for a major carrier. In 1998, she was traveling as a passenger in first class with a friend of hers who was a pilot. The pilot took out his AT&T flip phone, called his wife, and handed it to Mary Ellen, and they chatted until the flight attendant on duty came by and scolded them for using a phone in flight. It turns out that these older analog phones had stronger transmitters, and we're not giving them enough credit for their ability to connect. I'm just going to quote New York Times. Now, I know that's mainstream, but this was less than 2 weeks after 9/11. They weren't trying to rebut the truth movement because there wasn't a truth movement yet. It said, quote, according to industry experts, it's possible to use cell phones with varying success during the ascent and descent of commercial airline flights. Some older phones, which have stronger transmitters and operate on analog networks, can be used at a maximum altitude of 10 miles. The fact of the matter is that cell phones can work in almost all phases of commercial flight, said Marvin Sirbu, professor of engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and it goes on. Okay, so I think we're not giving these phone calls enough credit. I don't think that they were crisis actors in this case, even though crisis actors have been used in many scenarios. You don't get $1 million and a new identity for just being a passenger on a plane or making a 30-second phone call. None of those people have been seen since 9/11. By the way, Clint, I also know there's a theory that those were not real people. I mean, John Oganowski, he came from my state, Massachusetts. He was well known in his neighborhood. His family's still up there. He hasn't been seen since 9/11. I was having coffee at my church shortly after 9/11. I met a lady who was a flight attendant who lost one of her best friends on one of those flights. One of the guys on Flight 175 was my mind's gone blank just for a second. He was a wing for the Boston Bruins in 1972. He scored a goal in the Stanley Cup. The New York Rangers were it was Ace Bailey. I'm sorry, it was Ace Bailey. He came off the bench, scored a goal to win it 6-5 for the Bruins over the Rangers. I remember that goal. He was a real person. He was on Flight 175 and tried to call his wife four times. He has not been seen since 9/11. He was a real person. So I don't think they would take a chance on a paid-off crisis actor coming forward after 9/11, after seeing all the doom and destruction, and saying, hey, I didn't know I was part of this. Those people are dead for sure. I believe that there was a real hijack. And I believe that this job was not carried out by Arabs who were unfamiliar with Boeings, but by Israeli special ops who were fully trained on Boeings, because El Al, the Israeli airline, has a whole fleet of 757s and 767s, which they could have used for practice on, been co-pilots on, been jump seaters on, which they could have brought into an Israeli hangar and practice cockpit invasion time and time again. And so let's talk a little bit about how Israeli special ops, who are not on a suicide mission, by the way, we're not talking suicide mission here at all, but we're talking about a real hijack. Other objects hitting the Twin Towers, as we've already discussed.
Right.
But on 9/11, I do believe that those planes were seized by real hijackers posing as Muslims. And how did they get into the cockpit? I asked Mary Ellen Moore about this, and she said that it was standard procedure before 9/11 that upon takeoff, every cockpit was locked to guard against a potential hijacking. And so I said, Mary Ellen, very important question, was the key in those cockpits universal, or did each cockpit have a unique key and lock set? She wasn't sure, so she asked her pilot friends. They told her it was a universal key. That meant for the Israelis to get inside the cockpit, we're talking about not Mossad now, we're talking about their Sayeret and Matkal, their military special ops, the only group you would trust with a mission like this. They were specialists in assassination, airline hostage situations. Danny-Lewin, who I mentioned was on row 9 of Flight 11, former captain in the Sayeret Matkal. He was trained to assassinate people with a credit card or his bare hands. He had bench pressed 315 pounds. We're talking about military pros. They got into the cockpit with a key. And if you look at the flight pattern for Flight 11, 2 guys in the front row of first class. To get into the cockpit, all you got to do is stand up and use that key to get in. Those pilots are dead before they knew it hit them. They didn't kick down the door. This 9/11 was perfectly planned. They had a key to get in. They didn't fight with the pilots. They killed them probably with something like an EpiPen injector containing poison. They would have killed them instantly. Gotten the pilots out of the cockpit. Contrary to what some people believe, there's plenty of space inside a cockpit to put the bodies. And you can read what Pilot A said about this. Now they're inside the cockpit. Now they're at the controls of the Boeing, which they have full knowledge of the controls on it. Let me pause here because I may have raised some questions about this theoretical scenario. By the way, I'm not being dogmatic about anything I've said today. Nukes, drones, missiles, Israeli special ops. None of this is dogmatic. It's a theory. We're just trying to move the 9/11 conversation closer to a reconstruction of the events of that day.
Absolutely. Nope. Keep going, man. This is great.
Okay, so if in fact they did hijack these planes and drones or cloak missiles at the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, where did they take them? Well, what are they right next to? What common denominator do we see all these planes? They're right next to the Atlantic Ocean. We believe that they took the planes over the Atlantic because the Pentagon, the plane that flew over the Pentagon is headed straight for the Atlantic. The plane that hit 175, if it doesn't hit the Twin Tower, it's headed straight for the Atlantic. Marilyn Moore, my flight attendant friend, made a very astute observation. She said, why is it that they only used planes bound for California? And she said, it must be because they wanted a full fuel load, not to create maximum damage to the Twin Towers, which we know that they didn't collapse from jet fuel burning. the reason they wanted maximum fuel load was for a maximum getaway, because as it turns out, the distance from Boston to California is the same as the distance from approximately the same distance as Boston to the Azores. And the Azores, which are islands that are off of both Portugal and Africa, the US has an air base called Lodges Air Base, which the CIA has used for secret rendition flights for a long time. So it's a CIA base. And we believe it's quite possible that the planes landed at Lodges for refueling. As a matter of fact, I linked in my articles to a article published in the New York Times the day before 9/11. It's about a Canadian airliner who was low on fuel and diverted to Lodges Air Base as a diversion airport for airliners in distress. Now, on the morning of 9/11, the U.S. disallowed any flights to land in America. You either had to go up to Canada or turn back to your point of destination or point of origin. Mm-hmm. So the Atlantic flight path map was very confused that day, and many planes from Europe were turning back, trying to find a base to land at. It would have been very easy for these 9/11 planes to blend in with all those hundreds of other flights and say to radio to Lodges, which has also already been given the go-ahead by Dick Cheney to refuel any plane in distress, to stay where flight American 66, we need to refuel. You land. The American Air Base guys are all glued to the television sets watching those images of planes crashing the Twin Towers. They're not watching as one man gets out of the plane to refuel it. And from Lodges, they fly those planes where it's now nightfall over sub-Saharan Africa, over poor countries like Chad and Mauritania. At high altitude, they're not going to even be noticed. You fly directly over to Saudi Arabia with Saudi permission. You fly to Israel. What's the best place to put these planes where nobody will ever find the planes or the passengers? In an Israeli hangar. And I think that could have been the final destination, except for Flight 93, which I think had a different scenario. But I think for the other three planes, the ones that allegedly hit the Pentagon and the Twin Towers, they were taken over the Atlantic. We can talk about how the passengers would have been killed. But
yeah, I want to ask you how air traffic control wouldn't have picked up those planes heading on a different flight path.
Okay. Actually, air traffic controls did do that. And so let me bring up another soundbite. This is from air traffic control on 9/11. And it's from the voice at the beginning is the clip from is a narrator on Pilots for 9/11 Truth. But then you hear the real clip.
When an unidentified target was approaching Washington, D.C. from the west, a message was sent out in the system that American 11 was still airborne.
Scoggins Military, Boston Center. Just had a report that American 11 is still in the air and it's on its way heading towards Washington.
Okay, American 11 is still in the air? On its way towards Washington?
It was definitely another aircraft that hit the tower. That's the latest report we have.
Okay.
I'm going to try to confirm an ID for you, but I would assume he's somewhere over either New Jersey or somewhere further south.
Okay, so American 11 isn't the hijack at all then, right?
No, he is a hijack.
American 11 is a hijack?
Yes.
And he's going into Washington?
It could be a third aircraft.
It could be a third aircraft going on to Washington. Do you have a Mode 3 on him, sir?
No, Mode 3, we're trying to get a radial to me if I can. This is a report I had from Washington Center. You might want to get someone on another phone talking to Washington Center, see if they have him tracked up.
Copy that.
And then get maybe a DC guard or somebody up there on the aircraft.
Okay, do you have a lat long right now on it?
I will try to get one.
Okay, copy, thanks.
Okay, Clint, so there we have a conversation between the military and the FAA, which is affirming that Flight 11 did not hit the Twin Towers, which is just what we've been saying, but is still airborne. Of course, that could have been a mistaken report, but it does corroborate what we're saying here. And let's see, remind me.
And then how we have, so we have that report. Why doesn't it keep going further, and how does this get squashed? And is there not other reports out there that are seeing 11 or 175 headed in a different direction?
Well,
is there collusion is there collusion going on at the level of even air traffic control?
I think that one thing to bear in mind is that 175 and 11 have their transponders off, and at this point, radar could have tracked them out to the Atlantic, but there's also the belief that they've crashed into these buildings, and a lot of confusion going on with all these war games that are taking place. Remember, there's a huge set of war games taking place, plus the fact that PTEC, the Israeli intelligence link firm, was providing software to the FAA and may have been putting false data into their computers. There's an array of possible explanations for that. But wherever they went, you would have to say that presumably FAA should have tracked them. But I think at this point, with all the confusion of the destruction of the World Trade Center and the transponders off, the radar that's heading out to sea amongst all the other flights that are on the computer screen probably aren't getting that much attention.
So in your article, you go back and forth on, how were the passengers then taken care of? And when do we think that most likely happened, and how did that happen?
Well, the first thing they would have had to do would be to shut off the airphone communications. And I received a copy from another pilot of a Boeing manual that shows how you can switch off the airphone system in an emergency from the cockpit. So, because obviously you can have phone calls occurring after the alleged strikes on the World Trade Center. But then as to how they dispose of the passengers, my first theory was that in a pressurized cabin, you throw some kind of poison gas in there. And on all these planes, there was some kind of an alleged bomb that the hijackers said they were wearing, and that would be that was used as a scare device against the passengers. And I thought, well, maybe that was really a poison gas canister, which they then threw into the cabin, while the hijackers then locked the cockpit door behind them and let the passengers suffocate from poison gas. Pilot A thought that was at first feasible, but he said that there's a possibility of air circulating from the cabin back into the cockpit. And he said he didn't think they would take that chance. He said there's a much simpler way to kill the passengers for pilots, from a pilot's perspective, which is you depressurize the cabin. You take the plane up to altitude, and it's true that when a cabin depressurizes, which you can do manually from the cockpit, you open the air outflow valves, and I guess could close the AC ducts. This isn't quite fresh in my mind, but it's easy to do for the pilot. Mm-hmm. And you pressurize the cabin, and then the oxygen mask will automatically deploy, but there's only 15 minutes of oxygen in them, whereas you have unlimited oxygen in the cockpit. And he said you could even manually deploy those oxygen masks prematurely, and then bring the plane up to 40,000 feet, and those passengers will suffocate within a minute. Mm. And he pointed out that flight 370, the Malaysian flight, afterwards something went wrong. It went right up to 40,000 feet, and he suspects that was an attempt to suffocate depressurize the cabin and destroy the passengers as well. So he said that's the cleanest way to do it, and then you bring the plane back down. Your passengers are dead, and you're alive in the cockpit, and that's what we think is the most likely explanation if this theory is correct.
Half of your article, you're dealing with things that have some real tangible evidence to it, and then the other half, there has to be some conjecture here. You did a great job showing that the Azores Islands are about the same, a little bit shorter actually than the distance to California, which all those planes were headed. So that could be a potential destination for them. And you talked about, you talked about again the CIA connections and how the Azores Islands have been used for things like this. And it's one of those things where how much time do we spend on the conjecture of things like this, like where did the passengers go? And then how much time do we spend on what we know already, and where do we even take it from here? I mean, where is the future of the 9/11 truther movement? Will our voice ever be heard on a judicial level?
Well, we are getting our message across, and we're seeing a tremendous growth in the truth movement, which ironically, just over these past 2 weeks, Clint, we've seen a diminishment in the size of the truth movement, in the sense that YouTube has shut down about 1,000 channels. Richie Ellen's show is gone. Mm-hmm. Richie from Boston, who had, I think it was over 100,000 subscribers. His channel was removed, and he got it back by having 57,000 subscribers right to YouTube, and he also got a lawyer. But now I understand that the Health Ranger, the Natural News channel, has been deleted by YouTube, and there's a massive censorship campaign going on because we've had success. And so the battle is before us to either get ourselves back onto YouTube. I'm not on YouTube myself, or to find alternative platforms to continue our message, because obviously we're being effective. But by the way, on the subject of 9/11, I also just wanted to mention 93 very briefly. What I proposed in my article is that I believe Flight 93 was indeed, there was a less roll on Flight 93. It took off 40 minutes late, and when the passengers allegedly tried to get into the cockpit, the plane was moving up and down in an effort to knock them off their feet, which indicates once again to me this is not an electronic hijack, which we know is impossible, but as a real pilot at the helm. And I do believe that plane was shot down. And in my article on 9/11 called 9/11 Simplified, I have some of the clips from, it was a live broadcast from major mainstream networks saying that the plane had been shot down. It had been intercepted on its way to Washington. And we have a clip of Dick-Cheney saying, yeah, I gave the order. You know, even though he didn't expressly say in that clip the plane was shot down, he said with a guilty expression, yeah, I gave the order.
And then one other very dramatic thing that our local troops are doing, and believe it or not, at the request of the White House. This is what's so interesting about living and working in Washington, D.C. The mayor called upon the Army National Guard to do several things, and the White House also called out the D.C. Air National Guard. Earlier today, an F-16 fighter aircraft from the 113th Wing of the D.C. Air National Guard was actually called upon to intercept a second aircraft that was perceived to be yet another threat to the Pentagon. They aren't giving any details as to exactly how they deterred that plane. Perhaps they'll be able to share that with us as the days go by, and it's not such a sensitive situation. But in any case, it is possible that there was a second aircraft that was headed toward the Pentagon, and because of the D.C. Air National Guard, that situation was taken care of.
Now, you and the President had earlier discussed rules of engagement for taking down a hijacked airplane, but you were the one who gave the direct order to shoot down a plane that you were told, as it turns out incorrectly, was headed for Washington.
Right. That's correct.
What's that moment like?
Well, it was necessary, and it was frankly, I didn't pause to think about it very much, because once one of those aircraft was hijacked, it was a weapon. We'd seen already, by that time, 3 of them go in to the Pentagon and the World Trade Center in New York. As a result, thousands died, and if we had been in a position to intercept one of those to keep it from striking its target, would we have done it? Absolutely. And what I did was pass on the President's approval of the basic proposition that we would, in fact, authorize our people to shoot down aircraft that had been hijacked and refused to divert. So I saw it as part of my responsibility, but I did it quickly.
Now, my own belief is that the passengers did realize what had happened that day. They had heard about the rest of the disasters on their working airphones or cell phones, and that they did attempt to enter the cockpit. You have to remember that the flight attendants themselves had a key to those cockpits, which they could use in an emergency situation. I do believe there was a stewardess, flight attendant, who was preparing a pot of boiling water. The story is that they overwhelmed, which I consider an Israeli hijacker that was guarding the cockpit door, and that they started to breach the cockpit. Now, one of those passengers was a pilot. He was not an airline pilot, but he was a trained pilot named Donald Green. And it's just possible that if they overwhelmed the Israeli hijackers inside that cockpit and regain control of that plane, with the help of some guidance from air traffic control and maybe Donald Green flying the plane, maybe where they could have made a rough landing. And if the public ever found out that those hijackers were Israelis, the entire post 9/11 scenario would have changed. There would have been no war against Afghanistan. Israel would have lost its special status with us. It would have probably lost its military aid. And so I don't think Dick Cheney ordered Flight 93 shot down because he wanted to save the White House. I think he ordered Flight 93 shot down to save 9/11. I think he wanted to make sure that the plans did not go wrong that day. If you talk to Chris Boleyn, he's written on this. He's spoken to people in Shanksville who saw bodies in scattered wreckage. I think that the whole is the missile that was intended to be used that day, or the drone, or whatever it was. I think that the plane itself was obliterated by an F-16. I think that the FBI put a total clamp on the scattered wreckage, which was scattered for miles. There was an engine found 600 feet from that hole. I think they shot it out of the air. The pilot would have been told, in the interest of national security, you can't talk about this. But I think that Flight 93 was shot down to preserve 9/11 and not to preserve the White House.
James, do you think we will see justice in our lifetime?
I'm confident that we'll see justice because I'm a believer in God, and I'm a believer in that there's going to be a day of judgment, and these people will ultimately pay. If they don't pay in this life, they're going to pay in the future for what they've done. I would love to see justice, and if we can bring God into the conversation, He wants His will done on earth as is in heaven. So He wants these people brought to justice. He wants justice done. That is the right thing to do. The more we get information out, and the closer we come to arriving at a accurate reconstruction of 9/11, the better the chance we have. Of course, they're fighting against this with mass media, disinformation, fluoride, anything they can do to dumb down the public. They're going to keep doing that. I'm concerned with this growing 5G network that they're supposed to have radio waves that are 25 times stronger than Wi-Fi. Who knows what havoc they could wreak on our minds with that. But yes, I think we should do everything we can in the meantime to continue to pursue the truth in these matters.
Yeah. I just want to encourage anyone listening to this to go to james-perloff.com and check out his articles that he wrote, 9/11 Simplified, and then also your article about talking to those 6 pilots, talking about 9/11. And it's, it goes into even more depth than we discussed in our short time together today. But I do believe 9/11 is something that's very vital to get to the bottom of. And most people, I find that find these the 9/11 truthers to just be a bunch of wackos, or people who haven't done their own homework. So if this is something that seems crazy on the surface, then I just recommend just do your own homework, look into it, and eventually you'll start realizing there's just way, way, way too many coincidences for the truther community just to be totally wacko and off their rocker on this whole thing, and that the story that we were fed on that day and since has been totally manipulated and lied about and covered up, and evidence that's been shoved away from our view, and the list goes on, and again it's all interconnected to not just what happened on 9/11. It's all interconnected to pretty much everything that's going on. I mean, these are all these events that take place. We had you on with talking about World War II the last time. Well, even World War II to 9/11, there are connections between it all, and it's all one big fluid history. These aren't isolated events that take place in a bubble, and this all of human history is that. And so I really appreciate guys like you, James, who are the great dot connectors, and we so appreciate the work that you've done. That you're someone who has a brain that's so detail oriented, and you're one that really is adamant on making sure that what you're saying it can be backed up with evidence, and then also just like you explained earlier, what is theory and what is fact, and you're really adamant on making sure, hey man, we're in the theoretical realm here, just so you know. And I really appreciate that, because that means that's important to know. James, I want to just thank you again for coming on. And is there anything you'd like to share with the people before we part?
I just would like to acknowledge what you said, that this is part of a continuum. 9/11 is not isolated. These kind of forces could not have been implanted in our government or in the globe without a lot of things happening before that. And 9/11 is part of a continuum that included the sinking of the USS Maine, the sinking of the Lusitania, which brought us into World War I, the foreknowledge and provocation of Pearl Harbor, which brought us into World War II. We must have gotten into that, I'm sure, in our World War II conversation. Tonkin Gulf, which got us into the Vietnam War, and I was thinking ahead to 1967, the attack on the USS Liberty, which was designed but failed to get us into the Six-Day War between Israel and our neighbors. The deception that caused Reagan to bomb Libya in 1986, obviously based on a Mossad misinformation from a Mossad transmitter planted in Tripoli. Baby incubators, helping to push us into the Gulf War of '91. And of course, Wesley Clark, again, he detailed that there was a plan in the Pentagon. General Wesley Clark said there was a plan in the Pentagon in 2001 to engage 7 countries in wars, which included Syria, which included Iran, which included Iraq, which included Libya. And so we had to have fake excuses like weapons of mass destruction and sarin gas attacks in order to justify those wars. But all of this is part of a continuum. It's important to know that history. That's one reason I did write my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Not trying to do too much of a plug here, but it's my best effort to try to paint that continuum to people, show them that there's media control, the Federal Reserve is controlled, that the people who occupy our cabinet positions usually come from a very select elite, and that there's a very broad program here for a police state ultimately in America, with things that will be very unpleasant if we don't stop it. So I appreciate your sharing so much of my own perspective and providing me with this opportunity. This is how we get messages out, is through venues such as your own, Clint.
Really appreciate it. Well, this is we've all figured out that the mainstream media ain't our friends. So, and it was that was. All solutions come from problems, and that's what alternative media has become. And it's one of those things. Even with alternative media, opens up new problems, if you will. And that's something that, as a community, we've been evolving and understanding. Like, where do we go wrong and where are we going right? And we're figuring it out right now. And honestly, with this censorship that's going on, if you ask me, it's a very good sign that we are hitting on some good stuff here. If there's no reason they would censor us otherwise. So let's just keep it up.
Successful.
Yeah.
You're right. And we will, as you say, we will make mistakes. A lot of what I've said today, admittedly, is conjecture, but I hope we've ruled out some things such as electronic hijack. I don't expect people to accept that, but look at the comments that the pilot made. He explains how 757, 767s work in great detail. So we're trying to be like a jury that's hammering out a decision on a verdict. We're trying to work out each detail and come closer to the truth. We'll probably, just like a jury, we'll never be 100% sure of the truth, but we can move closer towards it. We're trying to move rationally and logically. We are not motivated by any kind of political agenda. We're not motivated by 6-figure corporate salaries like these news or 7-figure. I don't know what they make at CNN. But we're not motivated by being paid big bucks. We're not. We're just looking for the truth and trying to make a better world. And I can't say that for our mainstream media.
Absolutely. James Perloff, thank you very much, my friend.
Thank you, Clint, for having me on Lords of Consciousness.